This is a story of Cold War conspiracy, a story of spies, labor unions, communist agitators, suspicious train derailments, the emperor taking the side of communists, and a US spy group with a secret prison in a mansion. This is a story about how the first president of the Japanese National Railway was run over by a train, and no one knows who did it.
Charlie Dogwood.
Hello and welcome to another Charlie Dogwood video. Today we're discussing what the Japanese call the 3 big Japanese National Railway mysteries. Bit of a mouthful. It has a little bit of something for everyone. Train derailments, conspiracy theories, and also the earliest days of the Japanese Communist Party. Today we'll be trying to figure out who did what and why, using both Japanese sources and even interviews with ex-CIA operatives taking years after the occupation of Japan ended. So, let's get into it. The Great Mystery. In the aftermath of World War II, Japan was left smoldering from the bombing campaigns launched by the US. With masses of unemployed former soldiers wandering around in the streets, and the country in a near-famine condition for years, by 1949, the government had found the perfect way to employ former soldiers, creating the government-run Japanese National Railway, JNR. And though inflation ravaged the Japanese economy, and the rail sector was heavily affected by labor conflicts sparked by the loosening of restrictions against organized labor, the concept seemed like it could work. They placed longtime rail bureaucrat Shimoyama Sadanori as the organization's head in June of 1949. Just over a month later, he would go missing, and the following day, the chopped-up remains of his body would be found on the railroad tracks. A series of train derailments would follow in quick succession, and investigators never seemed to figure out what really happened, instead creating a web of conspiracy. To save us the pain of having to go over what immediate post-war Japan was like for 5 minutes, we'll just go over the basics. Japan had some level of control over the country, but the supreme commander of Allied powers, aka SCAP, led by MacArthur, was able to direct affairs. It could censor the news, revoke the ability from certain people from taking part in politics, and could lean on the government to get things done. You know, like the Japanese Constitution, and land reform, and education reform, and economic reform, and many, many other things that MacArthur forced on Japan. Japan also had rampant issues with hunger, housing, law and order, and the so-called Third Nationals, or Sankokujin, major corruption scandals about once a year, and increasingly, as the 1940s went on, issues with labor organizations and communists. Among those labor organizations was the National Railway Workers Union, which was both more than happy to go on strike and was also under the influence of the Communist Party. The union, which had something like 96% of all railway employees as members, could bring the country to a standstill if it wanted to. Initially, this wasn't an issue for SCAP or MacArthur. In fact, one of the first things MacArthur did do was release the leaders of the Japanese Communist Party from their imprisonment. In the lead up to the war, the vast majority of the JCP's leadership had been captured and imprisoned, and they bled numbers. There's an even longer story there, but we don't have time to get into it. After the war, things couldn't have been further from their wartime position of decline. While they were far from the most institutionally powerful political party on the Japanese left at the time, they held a strong influence in the country via the pro-communist Korean organizations and their ties to organized labor. And even more than that, they had the protection of MacArthur and SCAP for a little while. In return, the JCP held a strongly pro-Soviet and pro-American line, holding up MacArthur and the Americans as liberators just as the Soviets. So strong was their respect for MacArthur that in 1947, when they planned a general strike to remove the conservative government at the time, MacArthur ordered that the general strike not go ahead, and the JCP's labor representative tearfully announced that the strike had been canceled on the radio rather than go up against SCAP and risk imprisonment or pissing off MacArthur. But between the incident with the general strike and the reverse course taken by MacArthur, as time went on, eventually he would fully turn against the left-wing elements in Japan. In the lead-up to the creation of the Japanese National Railway, the Japanese government created a law which forbade employees of major state-owned enterprises from striking. So as soon as the Japanese National Railway was made, the union would be legally forbade from striking, and they were not happy about it. The following year, on June 1st, 1949, the Japanese National Railway was created. The unassuming bureaucrat Shimoyama Sadanori was selected as its head. He had a lot on his plate. The Dodge Line economic policy that was geared towards stopping runaway inflation in the country meant that the Japanese National Railway was going to fire many workers to cut costs. It was reported that Shimoyama had also been opposed to the U.S. using Japanese railroads to transport military supplies, though there seems to be little basis to the claim. The month after his appointment, on June 5th, 1949, at 7:20 a.m., he left for work in his official Buick from Ota Ward and went off to the upscale Mitsukoshi department store in Nihonbashi. When he arrived, the store was closed, so he directed his chauffeur to go to the bank across from the J&R building in Chiyoda. Then he went back to the Mitsukoshi department store by 8:37 a.m. He told his driver that he would be in the Mitsukoshi department store for about 5 minutes and then return. But he would never return to his Buick. Every morning he met with his secretary at the entrance to the J&R building, so news of his disappearance spread fast. And with the already tense atmosphere from the job cut announcement meant that the police were called for right away. The police searched everywhere around the department store, including the far-off Asakusa station. There, several people came forward as witnesses. One person who had seen Shimoyama inside the Mitsukoshi department store described him as being surrounded by 3 or 4 men while walking somewhere. Later, a ticket checker at Gotano Station in Adachi Ward stated that he saw a man who looked exactly like Shimoyama. The man asked him if he knew the location of a nearby hotel, to which the man suggested one. However, the man that the ticket checker saw did not use the preferential pass that Shimoyama would have had. Others stated that they saw a man who looked like Shimoyama looking nervous in the vicinity of Gotano Station, walking around but not smoking, and later removing both his necktie and glasses. Shimoyama smoked and wore glasses. That and other descriptions of the man have led some to believe that the man there was instead a body double. After that, there were no sightings of him. He was a ghost. At around 12:24 a.m. the following day on the 6th, the final train for the day was departing down the line from Kitasenju Station to Ayase Station and was driving down the track almost completely in the dark because their main light wasn't working. When they finally reached the rail overpass from where Gotano Station's line crossed over the Kitasenju Ayase line, one of the engineers realized that they had ran over something. They stopped the train, and when they saw the body, they called the authorities. Shortly thereafter, the police arrived and confirmed it was the body of Shimoyama, and he had been cut into pieces. Furuhata Tanimoto of Tokyo University would be leading the autopsy. Furuhata was well known for his research into blood types at the time and was one of the leading forensic specialists in the country. However, later on, he would become infamous for his shoddy work on many cases, helping imprison men for crimes that they didn't commit, even using mathematical equations to try and solve cases for the police. Furuhata stated that Shimoyama's body had no vital reaction to the train running him over. So, according to him, Shimoyama had to have been dead before the train hit him, suggesting that he had been murdered. Another medical professor, dispatched from the Tokyo Medical Examiner's office, disagreed. The other professor noted that in certain parts of the body, there appeared to be a vital response consistent with being ran over, and that rain at the incident site meant that the actual amount of blood at the scene was unknown. Shimoyama's wife also stated that it could be a case of him taking his own life, though this would be largely ignored by pretty much everybody, other than a Keio University professor who claimed the scene was consistent with such an incident. Also among these men at the scene were Americans, the CIC, the Army Counterintelligence Corps, the older stepbrother of the CIA. And they weren't just average Americans, they were Nisei, the sons of Japanese immigrants to the US. Their involvement in the Pacific War effort had been important, and now, during the occupation, they were key to its success. Some were used as linguists by SCAP, and others, like in this case, were investigators.
Initially, the CIC was involved in trying to establish for the command in general that the area in which you were assigned was relatively secure and come up with a fairly good idea why it's secure. Our look at the community, making sure that they wouldn't somehow develop into some kind of force to disrupt our presence. And the Japanese being alert to any kind of mistreatment by the military. So our job was to look at that generally.
The CIC at the scene used luminol for the first time in Japanese history, hoping that blood evidence might provide some level of confirmation. The luminol detected only small amounts of blood on the rails, suggesting that Shimoyama didn't have a vital response and that the blood was from being run over and not from bleeding. And so it became a big argument. If he was already dead when the train hit him, that means that something had happened, likely suggesting murder. If he wasn't dead when the train hit him, it suggests that he was either drunk on the train tracks or laid himself out intentionally, or maybe someone, somehow, laid him out on the train tracks, waiting for the train. Either way, we aren't totally sure. Asahi Shimbun journalist Yara Kimio, who was at the scene, described the body being covered in Shimoyama oil, and that strange oils covered his body except for his shoes. To him, it seemed deeply unnatural and strange, leading him to become one of the major proponents of the murder theory, stating that these oils were potentially from a place that Shimoyama had been held at before his death. A second luminol test showed that there were further blood stains up the track, not far from where Shimoyama had been hit. By the embankment, there was a dilapidated building alongside the tracks, and there, further testing showed that large amounts of blood had been inside the building. The police tracked down the owner, and he stated that the blood was his as a result of an accident with a hatchet. Blood tests proved inconclusive. Neither major question in the incident was resolved. Ultimately, no one was sure of what to make of it, and even today, no one knows what really happened in the Shimoyama incident. But while the Shimoyama incident continued, there were other events happening in Japan. Just 10 days after Shimoyama's initial disappearance, an unmanned train with its dead man switch tied down flew into Mitaka Station in Tokyo, killing 6 men instantly and wounding an additional 20 people. The crash was less than 15 miles away from where Shimoyama's body was discovered. Investigators immediately decided that it was some sort of an act of sabotage by the Japanese Communist Party. Not long after, they rounded up 11 people, 10 JCP members who were working for JNR, and 1 non-political former employee, Takeuchi Keisuke. Takeuchi was placed under duress by the police and was coerced into making a confession that he was the sole perpetrator. The 10 JCP members were then immediately free. Takeuchi was given a trial. Not a fair one, but a trial. Takeuchi's defense was botched. His defense team didn't bring up his alibi and never called the witness that Takeuchi was relying on for his alibi. It was like they wanted him to go to jail. There were also issues with the whole theory of the case. The claim was that Takeuchi tied down the dead man's switch on the train with a cord to make sure it didn't stop, but no one ever proved that was even possible. Then there were rumors about criminal elements spreading false stories that the JCP had been behind the crash right after it happened, and that an American Army Jeep had been seen speeding away from the station after the crash. Takeuchi would later report that his lawyer had urged him to take responsibility for the incident, stating that if Takeuchi did, he would become a hero for the Japanese Communist Party. The implication from Takeuchi himself being that he had been made into a patsy for the party. Given that, according to the judge, Takeuchi didn't know that he would kill people, he was given a life sentence rather than a death sentence. This was heavily criticized, and on appeal was elevated to a death sentence. All throughout his imprisonment, he claimed innocence. He died in 1967 of a brain tumor, still on death row. Shimoyama's disappearance and suspicious death was big news. The Mitaka incident was big news too. The JNR had a very controversial first few weeks in operation, and it was about to get much worse. A little over a month later, in a small town known as Matsukawa in Fukushima Prefecture, yet another train derailed. Instead of a dead man's switch being tied down, the track itself was sabotaged. When the train reached the point when the sabotage occurred, It derailed, killing the 3 crewmen of the engine. Along the rail where the crash occurred, the fish plates connecting the rails together had been removed, and the cross ties had their nails pulled out. But on top of that, a single steel rail of 25 meters in length and 925 kilos, that's about 2,000 pounds, had been removed and moved 13 meters, about 43 feet, into the neighboring rice paddy. This was not the work of one man, nor even a pair of men, but a team of men who knew how the rails were constructed. Because of the 2 prior incidents in quick succession, the Matsukawa incident was quick to attract attention, and public opinion placed them together as a string of interconnected incidents. The government itself described these incidents as being from the same, quote, ideological undercurrent, with the obvious implication being that this was the work of the Japanese Communist Party. The police had decided from the start that the most recent Matsukawa incident was the Communist Party's handiwork. They identified a 19-year-old who had been arrested for rape. Some contend that the rape was fictional, and afterwards they wrapped him up in the investigation and he confessed, likely under force. News of this confession spread fast. After that, a group of 19 men, either National Railroad Union members or members of a local factory union, were arrested. A woman was also arrested in connection with the case for the crime of creating an alibi for the men. Before long, 8 of those 20, alongside the original 19-year-old, had confessed, and from those 9 confessions, the patchwork narrative of the derailment was created. At the first trial, all those who confessed were quick to recant, and there was no actual material evidence tying them to the crime. As a result of the first trial in 1950, 5 men had been given the death sentence, 5 had been given a life sentence, and the rest had received sentences ranging from 15 years to just over 3 years. Though this was far from the end of it. During the intervening period between the first trial in 1950 and the appeal trial in 1953, public opinion swung heavily in favor of the accused. Just recently, in 2019, it's not very recent actually, papers of the post-war steward of the imperial family were discovered, and while they made the news for more important things like the fact that Emperor Hirohito wanted to publicly apologize for the Second World War as early as 1953, among the papers was the recording of a conversation where the emperor supported the accused communists in the Matsukawa incident and believed that the US was behind the event. There were claims that the whole affair was revenge for the Taira incident that had occurred in Fukushima, which was an attempted riot by the JCP earlier in the year that resulted in over 200 members of the JCP and communist Zainichi Korean activists getting arrested. But once again, actual evidence for this claim remains non-existent. It took until 1963, 14 years since the Matsukawa incident, that the 20 accused were declared innocent and allowed to walk free. But while legal struggles waged on for some time, the derailments, crashes, and whatever happened to Shimoyama had stopped. Shimoyama died on the 6th of July. The Mitaka incident happened 9 days later, on the 15th. The Matsukawa incident happened 33 days later, on the 17th of August. In a matter of about 42 days, it all went down. Just as soon as it had begun, it had ended. In none of these cases were the true culprits found. Questions remained. As time wore on, people became more and more desperate for the truth, and so they began to focus on the U.S. occupation as a potential source for the derailments and the disappearance and death of Shimoyama. In particular, they focused on a man named Willoughby. The Willoughby argument. Commonly referred to as the worst intelligence chief in U.S. Army history, incredible title by the way, Charles A. Willoughby was a naturalized German who had served in the U.S. Army since World War I. MacArthur jokingly called Willoughby his pet fascist, poking fun at his foreign extraction and extreme conservatism. He's featured prominently in almost every single conspiracy theory about the occupation of Japan. This is because he headed a group inside of SCAP called G2.
We were always in that position of guiding them so that their process of doing their job was not totalitarian. So they were getting messages from the government section, which encouraged liberal movement. Then you had General Willoughby. G2 was more traditional conservative approach. And so that the signals that the Japanese were getting may say, go easy, no, go stern, do this and that, there's that. So they were always listening to guidance.
G2 opposed GS and had control over the press code for Japan, which allowed them to censor Japanese newspapers. Willoughby put a lot of effort in increasing the powers of Japanese policing, as well as working to get certain war criminals out of trouble if they proved useful for the US. Major politically connected far-right criminals like Sasakawa Ryoichi and Kodama Yoshio were saved by Willoughby, as was the head of Unit 731, Ishishiro. It was Willoughby who helped shepherd Ishii out of trouble in exchange for research information that Ishii had gained from horrible human experimentation. As the 1940s moved forward, the liberal GS fell to the side, and Willoughby's G2 became ascendant. His primary unit involved in deep cover work was an outfit called Z Unit.
I suspect that the organization to which I was tied to in the occupation, that is variously known as the JSOB, Joint Special Operation Branch, and our unit was known as Z Unit, and it was headed by Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cannon. We lived in Baron Iwasaki's main house near Shinobazu Lake. It was a 15-acre estate. There were 12 case officers operating from this mansion. Well, anyway, our organization that's there, the Hongo House Unit or Cannon Kikang or Z Unit, has been described as having been responsible for many of the unsolved mysteries of the occupation, because we were charged to do things that nobody else did or authorized to do. There were different kinds of things that Willoughby wanted done that others didn't do or were not in position to do or not authorized. Cannon was a guy completely out of the box. He was a former Texas Ranger before the war, and he was capable of thinking out of the box. He was out of the box, but thinking out of the box. And he was very astute in many, many ways. I learned a great deal from him just being with him for a while. Well, he and I were the only one trotting around the countryside. Well, I worked with Cannon in 1947 to 1952. He came to Niigata to look me over. And the next thing I knew, he didn't talk to me, directly. You want to join me or nothing? I just got assignment to Yokohama, and that was it. That seemed to have been my career. Don't ask questions, get a move on.
Z Unit was used for anything that Willoughby thought was important to do in the shadows, ranging from armed police raids on North Korean heroin and later amphetamine trafficking, as well as working with ethnic Korean gangsters like Hisayuki Machi, who headed the Toseikai gang in Tokyo to help suppress leftist demonstrators in the city when they popped up.
Willoughby says, get rid of that guy, a diplomat, because he's a troublemaker. So we had to figure out a way so that the Japanese authority will boot him out. We would stake the guy out and make sure that he could be incriminated, and the Japanese would find evidence that the naughty boy, out he would go, kind of thing. We had license to establish the rat line into North Korea and China for the down pilot to come in. And we used the narcotic routes, which was not terribly successful, but we used to get Red Line brand narcotics, 99.9% pure heroin. I mean, very pure stuff used to come in. And we would get, 2 or 3 kilos of kind of thing. So we were authorized to establish a maritime link into North China and Korea. So therefore, our link to the maritime service, the Bureau, whenever our boats got in jam, we'll tell them that boat's off limit. They'll send the word, it's off limit, boat's released, or something like that. And no questions asked.
During those days, mysterious ships from Korea have tried to smuggle people or drugs into Japan, usually for intelligence purposes. North Korean spy boats even today continue to appear near Japan. Jack Cannon himself was an interesting figure. He was talented at judo, maintained intelligence assets in the Russian embassy and all over Japan, and had even been regarded as the potential shooter on the grassy knoll by some. For years, the group worked in the shadows of Japan, hidden from the Japanese public and press. However, an incident involving the writer Kaiji Wataru would spell the end of Z Unit and reveal the existence of the group to the Japanese public. Kaiji Wataru had been a well-known writer and political activist until his sudden disappearance. The story of his career is a long one, having taken part in the student communist movement before his arrest and temporary ideological conversion away from communism. After his release, he made his way to China and worked as a leader in organizing Japanese POWs into anti-Japanese psychological warfare forces. Once the war was over, he returned to Japan and stayed away from the political scene, suffering from tuberculosis. As part of his recuperation from tuberculosis, Kaiji took regular walks along the railroad tracks by his home. While taking one of these walks one morning, a jeep filled with American soldiers pulled up behind him, hit him in the head, and kidnapped him. This really happened, by the way. This isn't like conspiracy theory stuff. They drove up behind him and whacked him in the head. Seriously. Pretty crazy. Kaiji was kept in the basement prison of the Hongo house. He was questioned again and again about his activities, and if he was a Soviet spy. Eventually, they began to demand that he flip and become a double agent for the US. Twice during imprisonment, he attempted to take his own life, but still, he was kept imprisoned. Eventually, a guard, a Japanese man who had been employed by Z Unit, felt pity for him and put him in contact with his family. Shortly after, his family contacted the police, and people began to demand his release. But remember, the press was still censored, and so was news of this incident. Eventually, though, he was released in central Tokyo. Soon after, he was compelled to testify in the Japanese Diet. There, the testimony of others revealed that Kaiji had for some time been an American agent who started to get closer to the Soviets, and as a result, was kidnapped. Later charges stemming from a case relating to violating laws regulating radios as a result of his intelligence activities proved that he was spying for someone, but the specifics, unfortunately, remain murky, like everything else in this case. Despite the small amount of information that had leaked to the public, it was enough to be a mortal blow to Z Unit, or that's what it seemed like.
The interesting thing about the Korean War is that when the war broke out, General MacArthur moved all his staff to Korea, and our unit as well. The Z Unit went out, and we were transferred back to Tokyo administratively. So it was a paper exercise. My record shows that I served in Korea, but I never set foot in Korea.
With Willoughby and MacArthur focused on Korea, the influence of G2 had declined. But that didn't mean that Z Unit was replaced by something led by the liberal-orientated GS. No, that time was long gone. Instead, the CIA, long the enemy of Willoughby and Z Unit, stepped in to fill the void.
Until CIA was accepted, MacArthur and Willoughby did not want CIA presence in the Far East Theater. It was kept out. OSS was kept out. The closest was in Shanghai. OSS Shanghai moved to Yokosuka and became FRUFEC, Field Research Unit, Far East Command. And Willoughby's instructions is, I want to know what in the hell they're doing here in my turf. So at one point, until CIA was accepted within the military hierarchy as an acceptable partner, they were hands off. And we were given the charge to find out what the CIA was doing, like surveillance and all that.
The CIA's involvement in Asia helped birth rumors that added to the so-called black fog that hung over Japanese politics from the occupation era, cooking up a rumor that Willoughby was involved in a harebrained coup plot to shoot the pro-American, anti-communist Prime Minister Yoshida and replace him with an anti-communist nationalist, Hatoyama. It made no sense, but the CIA claimed that some 500,000 men could be called up in support of the plot. I don't think that's happening. However, the narrative for Willoughby, and by extension, the US, and the death of Shimoyama, and the intentional derailments remains a common theory. The narrative is this. 1. G2 and Willoughby, having been empowered by the reverse course, began to involve themselves in the attempted destruction of organized labor and the Japanese Communist Party. 2. The constant strikes on Japanese railways proved a major issue for the country, and the deep involvement of the Japanese Communist Party, JCP, was a serious concern for Willoughby and SCAP. 3. That the sudden increase in seats for the Japanese Communist Party in the 1949 House of Representatives election frightened Willoughby and SCAP. 4. For the sake of cracking down on both organized labor and the growing Japanese Communist Party, that a series of incidents be staged to cast blame on the JCP and unions. 5. The first president of JNR, Shimoyama, was either murdered by the US for refusing to go along with the large-scale firings acquired by the Dodge Line, or killed himself as a result of the demands for them. Alternate theories also state that he was in opposition to the transportation of American military supplies on the rail lines. The most glaring issue with this logic is the idea that Shimoyama was in opposition to the transportation of US military supplies. Shimoyama had died before the Korean War. Why would that be a major concern before the war? It makes no sense. And even more importantly, it wouldn't have been something that the US had to deal with. They could have just removed him.
One other thing is that the mysterious disappearance of Shimoyama is attributable to us or our organization because it was the occupational policy to get rid of Shimoyama. This is a Japanese newspaper thinking.
And was the occupation authorities interested in the disappearance of the civilian? I would think that a person of that position would be very much, would work very closely with the occupation forces.
That's right.
No.
But if you look at this logically and with trained mind, you would say it does not make sense. But the Japanese believe this. They think that I'm the guy that's holding the key to this thing. So I described, as you had tried, to point out that there's a total disconnect between reality and logic or reason that people like you or I would say, why would the occupation do away with the president of National Railway? Why would we want to create a series of sabotage situations? Well, maybe you're fighting this communism thing and blame it on the labor union. I said categorically, with no exception, without any hesitation, is totally bunk.
2 months before the death of Shimoyama, a train derailed in Shikoku's Ehime prefecture on the Yosan line. 3 were dead, 3 were wounded. The fish plates had been removed. The nails in the cross ties had also been removed, and the rail was pulled away to the side. It was exactly the same as what happened at Matsukawa. In April of 1948, back before Shimoyama, months before the anti-strike bill had been drafted, back before the election of 1949, a town called Niwasaka was the site of a derailment by removed nails on the rails. 3 had died. This was the first time that had happened. Niwasaka, the Yosan Line incident, and Matsukawa, they were all likely connected. The 2 earliest cases, Niwasaka and the Yosan Line, didn't give us much to go off of in terms of evidence. The Niwasaka incident provided nothing in terms of evidence. In fact, potential leads or sensible theories included. The Yosan Line incident is a little bit more fruitful. The tools used were found and were determined to not be the tools used on government railways. Additionally, it appeared that an American Army boot print was on one of the cross ties. Supposedly, the one individual, a Japanese man who was arrested for the incident, swallowed poison while in custody and died. The election of 1949, the anti-strike bill, the Korean War, none of these seemed to have an effect on these derailments. The US could have just forced Shimoyama out of power if they wanted him gone. The US virtually forced the Constitution on the Japanese. How could Shimoyama stand up against that level of influence? They could just make him leave the position. They did not need to kill him. Well, the only reason for Shimoyama to be killed by the US would be to frame the leftists or labor organizers. So that brings us to the various questions about the labor union. The union argument.
I'd like to discuss whether there was an outside force supporting the student movement, for example.
Yes, in the sense that there are guidance being provided by the labor unions who were leftists who had ties abroad. And this was very prominent in the sense of sabotage and demonstrations against established entities such as Japan National Railway, JNR. Let's say the labor union that created sabotage. since we didn't do it, who does it? Who profits? I said, the first question you ask, who profits by any of the action that you are suggesting? Disappearance, sabotage. Is there anything reasonable that you can say, we, the occupation, profited? No.
Which element would have profited from?
It's the labor union. And
But
labor union would have a higher interest than just JNR.
have the press gone after the labor union with the same intensity that they have come to you?
I don't know. I don't think so. If they did, they should be able to find a number of leads that would help them solve the various issues. So labor unions would be, from the capability point of view and international linkage, a higher order than students. And students are creating enough problem as it is. So you have this linkage, labor union, labor international tie-in.
The labor union, or the JCP, being behind the derailments is rather odd when you think about it. Most of the people who died or were wounded in these incidents outside of the Mitaka incident were engineers or other workers on the railroads. Almost all of them would have been union members. The truth is that the union was highly unlikely to be involved in any of these derailments. Shimoyama was another thing entirely, however.
There was a ongoing sabotage and strike and so forth in the Japan National Railway. The president of the railway was called Shimoyama, and the railways were sabotaged, demonstrations ongoing. Shimoyama disappeared. Newspaper reporters tracked him to the Mitsukoshi department store. He just completely disappeared.
Shimoyama, the man who was the target of anger of the labor unions, seemingly a stooge of the US, would be the perfect target for the labor union. But that's all conjecture. In any case, there were still even further incidents for us to look at. On July 11th, 1950, a little over 1 year since the Shimoyama incident, another intentional train derailment occurred at Mitsuseki Station in northern Japan. As a freight train passed by, it switched over into the safety siding and derailed. Within a month, the police had determined that not only was the accident on purpose, but that it had been done by a former track workman. He was recommended a sentence of 15 years behind bars. The following year, in 1951, up in Hokkaido, another train derailed. Rail fish plates had been removed, and the rail had been moved about 4 centimeters, suggesting a lack of manpower or time compared to other attempts of this style of derailment. The crash only wounded 1 engineer. About 600 railroad workers and union members were investigated, but ultimately no one was charged. This was called the Marimo-go incident. This was followed up by the Aoume incident, which occurred at Ozaku Station in Tokyo. 4 freight cars suddenly started to roll forward and crashed into a sitting passenger train. No one was hurt. The cops quickly rounded up 10 Communist Party members and labor union members. Then the cops got someone to confess. Big surprise, it was coerced. The legal odyssey kicked off by the Aoume incident lasted until the late 1960s, by the way. These 3 derailments were different from the others. Firstly, they didn't kill anyone. Secondly, they were potentially JCP or union related, at least in my mind. Part of why this could be said is because of a major policy change inside the JCP in 1950. With MacArthur embracing the reverse course against leftism and the intensification of the Cold War, the JCP began to argue among itself. It also began to suffer withering criticism from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the wake of the Korean War, demanding that the JCP take a more proactive, revolutionary role. The majority faction, led by the party leader, Tokura Kyuichi, came to embrace the concept of violently opposing and ultimately overthrowing the Japanese government, becoming the official party line in 1951. This led to numerous violent incidents by the JCP and attempts to establish guerrilla bases in the mountains of Japan. A notable element of this period was that the JCP's Sapporo branch was strongly radical. They were involved in a number of incidents, and a detective even ended up getting shot to death by one of their members, not too long after the Marimo-go derailment. But even that remains conjecture. We'll never know if the two were connected. Questions Without Answers. The book entitled Black Fog Over Japan, written by detective fiction writer Matsumoto Seicho, was published at the height of anti-Americanism in Japan blurring the lines between fiction, fact, and outright conspiracy theorism. The book blames American agents for a variety of crimes and plots, including the Korean War. Black fog over Japan is but a piece of narrative of the occupation days. Leftists and Japanese nationalists on the right have both accused the US of various crimes and conspiracies, but for the vast majority of these accusations, proof remains incredibly thin. In 1952, the occupation ended, and Z Unit was folded into the CIA outfit in the country. Most of the members of Z Unit, like Alonzo Bain Shattuck, who is one of the few to openly speak about his operations in Japan, simply refused to join the CIA. Others, like Z Unit's leader, Jack Cannon, tried to avoid joining, but were eventually forced to join later on, since they were in the government intelligence service already. The intentional derailments had stopped. What did or did not happen to Shimoyama was never discovered. As time went on, the statute of limitations on all of the incidents rolled on by, but people never forgot. As its members passed away over the years, Z Unit would fade into the mist of history, just another historical mystery among many. One of the last surviving members was Victor Matsui. He lived out the rest of his life in Northern Virginia, around the site of his former employer, the CIA.
I was offered a job to go abroad again, and I was then joined the Foreign Service of the United States and served in the collection of political, economic, and whatever information that was needed in specific areas where I was assigned. In succession, I was assigned to Cambodia for 2 years, then transferred to Egypt, never made it back to Egypt, and then went to Pakistan instead for 3 years, which was very interesting. Then 3 years in Madagascar back to back, and then 3 years in Ivory Coast back to back, from which was carpetbagging to Upper Volta, Niger, Bamako, and Sierra Leone, and then reassigned to Zaire, now known as Congo, a very complicated country.
In 2011, he received a gold medal from Obama. Very cool, Victor. Keep up the good work. The Matsukawa incident, connected to the earlier Yosan Line incident, Niwasaka incident, and the later Marimo Go incident, all derailed the same way, by removing the fish plate connectors and pulling the rail aside. Despite their similar approach, they used different tools, and in the Marimo Go derailment, the moving of the rail was bungled and seemed to only mimic the earlier, more famous incidents. The Mitaka incident, an unmanned freight train plowed into a station with its dead man's hand having been tied down. Shimoyama, the incident that kicked off the frenzy, but seemingly has the least information about. We can't even determine if there was a vital reaction when he was run over or not. We'll never know exactly what happened to him, and why. Over the years, the history has been muddled, and while it's always been impossible to separate fact from fiction in these types of incidents, the passage of time has made it all too easy to develop a false narrative of events. Just to give an example, as you'll recall, many mysterious boats have been caught trying to enter Japanese waters over the years. In one major case in 1960, a boat captain was arrested in connection to smuggling people into Japan. Nakajima Tatsujiro, a former IJA intelligence officer, was that boat captain. He claimed that he'd earlier been involved in a plot against Mao Zedong by bombing him with mortars when his army entered Beijing. Though upon closer inspection, he confused the nationalities, names, and even occupations of his supposed collaborators. In 1963, he was poisoned in a cafe, barely surviving according to his own recollection. In 1970, he claimed that he worked with Z Unit and had been one of the, quote, true culprits behind the Matsukawa incident, and provided a very detailed story and background for his involvement in the incident. But the length that he stated that they moved the rail was significantly different, just a few centimeters rather than multiple meters. This is just one of the many theories and confessions made by various figures over the years. Given that the statute of limitations have long since faded away, people in the 1960s and 70s could just come out and claim to have been involved, get attention, and face no legal repercussions for it. It's down to the point where Shimoyama's dog is involved in some of these theories, but we'll never know the full story. Or the true story, for that matter, unless you can talk to dead people. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the video. Also, feel free to check out my Twitch, Stream VOD Channel. All links are in the description. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.